It was supposed to be one of those perfect Saturday afternoons, the kind you dream about when you're stuck in traffic or waiting in line at the grocery store. The sun was shining just right. Not too hot, not too cold, and there was a gentle breeze that made the trees sway lazily. My husband, James, had fired up the grill, and the smell of sizzling burgers wafted through the air. Our golden retriever, Max, lay nearby, his big brown eyes half closed as he soaked up the sunshine. He wasn't just any dog. He was James' service dog, trained to help him manage anxiety from his time in the Army. Max was family, and everyone who met him loved him. We hadn't lived in Willow Creek Estates for very long, just 6 months, but we were starting to feel like we belonged. Sure, the Homeowners Association, HOA, had its share of rules. No flags on fences, no loud music after 10 p.m., no outdoor decorations without approval. You know, the usual stuff. But we followed them because, honestly, it seemed easier than dealing with complaints. Or so we thought. That's when she showed up. Karen Lindstrom. If you've ever heard someone describe a Karen, this woman was the textbook definition. She strutted into our backyard like she owned the place, her oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't even bother saying hello before launching into her spiel. "Excuse me," she said loudly, cutting off our conversation with friends mid-sentence. "I need to remind you about the noise ordinance. Your music is far too loud." James glanced over at the small Bluetooth speaker sitting on the picnic table. It wasn't even turned all the way up. You could barely hear it over the sound of laughter and the crackling grill. "Ma'am," he replied politely, "we're barely playing anything. No one's complained." Karen smirked, her lips curling into what looked more like a sneer than a smile. "Well, I'm complaining now. And FYI, dogs aren't allowed off-leash in common areas, including backyards during social gatherings." She pointed dramatically at Max, who was happily wagging his tail and sniffing her shoes. I felt my stomach tighten. This couldn't be happening. "Max is a service dog," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. "He's trained to stay close to James. He doesn't count as off-leash." Karen rolled her eyes like we were wasting her precious time. "Semantics," she snapped. "The rules are clear. If you don't comply." Before she could finish her sentence, James interrupted her. "We're not breaking any rules, Karen. Why don't you go enjoy your day instead of ruining ours?" Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought steam might come out of her ears. But instead of arguing further, she spun around and marched away, muttering something under her breath about people these days and how they don't respect authority. At the time, we laughed it off. Karen was annoying, sure, but she was just one person. How much trouble could she really cause? We went back to enjoying the afternoon, thinking nothing more of it. Little did we know, Karen wasn't done with us. Not by a long shot. About an hour later, the mood in our backyard had shifted completely. The initial tension caused by Karen's unexpected visit had faded, replaced by laughter and the clinking of glasses as friends chatted and enjoyed the food. James was back to flipping burgers on the grill, and Max had stretched out in the shade, his tail thumping lazily against the grass. For a while, it felt like everything was normal again. But good moments never last long when you live in a place like Willow Creek Estates. That's when we heard raised voices coming from the front yard. Curious, and maybe a little worried, I excused myself and walked around the house to see what was going on. What I saw made my jaw drop. There was Karen, clipboard in hand, yelling at Mr. Patel, the elderly man who lived next door. Poor Mr. Patel looked bewildered as he held his electric hedge trimmer in one hand. Apparently, Karen had decided that his leaf blower, which he hadn't even turned on yet, was violating some obscure quiet hours policy. "This is unacceptable," Karen shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire street. "I'm calling the HOA board right now." I stood there for a moment, shaking my head. It was ridiculous. Saturday afternoon wasn't exactly quiet hours, And besides, Mr. Patel wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, Karen seemed determined to make a scene. Shaking my head, I went back to the backyard, hoping to leave the drama behind. But fate had other plans. Minutes later, Karen reappeared, this time storming directly toward James and Max. Her face was red, her eyes blazing with anger. She marched right up to us, ignoring the fact that we were surrounded by guests. "You think you can ignore me?" she spat, pointing her finger accusingly at James. "You think you're above the rules." James set down his spatula and faced her calmly. "Karen, we've already talked about this. We're following the guidelines. Can we please just let it go?" "No, we cannot just let it go," she snapped, mocking his tone. Then, without warning, she reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a can of pepper spray. Before anyone could react, she aimed it at Max and fired. Time seemed to freeze. The spray hit Max square in the face, and the poor dog yelped in pain, stumbling backward before collapsing onto the grass. James lunged forward, shouting, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back, looking smug, until Max, disoriented and scared, accidentally bumped into her leg. She screamed bloody murder, clutching her shin like she'd just been attacked by a wild animal. "Oh my God, this animal attacked me," she wailed, theatrically dropping to the ground. "Call 911. Someone call 911. By now, everyone at the party had gathered around, horrified. Some people called for help, while others tried to comfort Max, whose eyes were watering uncontrollably. James knelt beside him, whispering soothing words and gently wiping his face with a damp cloth. Meanwhile, Karen continued her performance, writhing on the grass and moaning about how she'd been brutally assaulted. At one point, she whipped out her phone and started recording herself. "Look what they did to me," she cried, pointing at her leg, which appeared perfectly fine except for a tiny scuff mark where Max had brushed against her. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found Karen still sprawled on the lawn, sobbing hysterically, while our friends and neighbors surrounded James and Max, defending them fiercely. The officers separated us, asking questions and taking statements. Despite multiple witnesses confirming that Max hadn't done anything aggressive, Karen insisted she was the victim. "That beast attacked me," she repeated, glaring daggers at us. "And they're violating HOA codes left and right." James, normally level-headed, struggled to keep his cool. "Are you serious right now?" he shot back. "Your own actions caused this mess. You sprayed an innocent dog." Eventually, the officers decided to file a report, but told us no charges would be pressed unless further evidence emerged. They warned us, however, that Karen planned to escalate the matter to the HOA board and possibly sue. As we carried Max inside to recover, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. The chaos that unfolded after Karen's pepper spray attack was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It felt like the entire neighborhood had been thrown into some bizarre reality show where everyone was forced to take sides, and no one knew who would come out on top. The police officers tried their best to keep things under control, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen, still sprawled dramatically on the grass, refused to calm down. She clutched her leg as if it were broken, even though we could all see that the only injury was a faint scuff mark from where Max had accidentally bumped her. Her exaggerated moans and cries for help were so over the top that they almost bordered on comical, if the situation hadn't been so infuriating. Every few seconds, she'd glance up at the officers with wide, teary eyes and insist that Max had attacked her. Meanwhile, James stayed by Max's side, his voice soft but firm as he reassured our poor dog. Max was clearly shaken, his big brown eyes watering and his body trembling as James gently wiped his face with a wet cloth. Our friends and neighbors formed a protective circle around them, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright anger. One of our guests, A retired teacher named Linda knelt beside James and offered to call an emergency vet just to be safe. Another neighbor, Tom, stood near Karen with his arms crossed, glaring at her like he wanted to say something but was holding back for the sake of keeping things civil for now. The officers did their best to sort through the conflicting stories. They spoke to Karen first, jotting down notes as she recounted her version of events in painstaking detail. According to her, she had simply been enforcing the HOA rules when Max lunged at her, forcing her to defend herself with pepper spray. Never mind that Max wasn't even off-leash, or that he weighed nearly 80 pounds. It didn't stop her from painting him as some kind of vicious monster. When it was our turn to speak, James laid out the facts calmly but firmly. He explained that Max was a certified service dog trained to assist him with anxiety, which made the leash rule irrelevant. He also pointed out that Karen had escalated the situation unnecessarily by using pepper spray without provocation. Several of our guests backed him up, describing how Max had done nothing aggressive before being sprayed. Even Mr. Patel, who had witnessed Karen's earlier tantrum over his hedge trimmer, stepped forward to vouch for us. Despite the overwhelming evidence supporting our side, the officers couldn't ignore Karen's theatrics entirely. They warned us that while no charges would be filed immediately, Karen intended to escalate the matter to the HOA board and possibly pursue legal action against us. As they packed up their gear and left, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just about a ruined BBQ anymore. It was about protecting our family. And Max, from someone who seemed determined to make our lives miserable. After the cops drove away, the party dissolved into quiet murmurs. Some people stayed behind to offer their support, while others quietly slipped away, probably worried about getting caught in the crossfire. Those who remained helped us carry chairs and plates inside, offering hugs and words of encouragement. A few even promised to testify on our behalf if things went to court. As James and I settled Max onto his favorite blanket in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Karen wasn't the type of person to let something like this go quietly. If anything, she'd use it as fuel to double down on her vendetta against us. But one thing was certain, we weren't going to back down either. Not when we knew we were in the right. That night, sleep felt impossible. My mind was racing with everything that had happened. Karen's outrageous behavior, the look of pain in Max's eyes, and the way she'd twisted the entire situation to paint herself as the victim. It wasn't just frustration or anger keeping me awake. It was a nagging feeling that there was more to Karen than met the eye. How could someone act so unhinged over something as minor as HOA rules? Was she really that obsessed with control, or was there something deeper driving her actions? I decided to do some digging. Sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, I started searching online for anything I could find about Karen Lindstrom. At first, I didn't expect much. After all, how many people would openly talk about their experiences with a neighbor like her? But as I scrolled through local forums and social media groups, I began to uncover a pattern. One post caught my attention. A former Willow Creek resident described how Karen had once called animal control on their cat simply because it wandered onto her porch. Another recounted how she'd threatened legal action after their child accidentally kicked a soccer ball into her yard during a game. The more I read, the angrier I became, but also more determined. Then, I stumbled upon something even bigger, a lawsuit involving Karen and a previous homeowners association. According to court documents, she'd been accused of using her position on the board to bully residents into compliance, often resorting to intimidation tactics. The case was eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the details painted a chilling picture of someone who thrived on power and manipulation. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was wielding them like weapons to assert dominance over anyone who dared challenge her. By the time James woke up the next morning, I had pages of notes spread across the table. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as I showed him what I'd found. "This explains so much," he muttered, shaking his head. "She doesn't care about the rules. They're just an excuse for her to control people." We knew we couldn't fight this alone. That afternoon, we reached out to a few trusted neighbors who had witnessed Karen's meltdown at the BBQ. To our relief, they were eager to help. Over coffee and muffins, we shared what I'd uncovered and brainstormed ways to hold Karen accountable. Someone suggested drafting a petition to demand her removal from the HOA board. Others offered to gather signatures or speak publicly about their own run-ins with her. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan and a growing sense of hope. But taking on Karen wouldn't be easy. Even though we had evidence and support, she still had influence within the neighborhood. Some residents were too intimidated to speak out, fearing retaliation. Others might side with her simply because they didn't want to get involved. We knew we had to tread carefully if we wanted to make real change. As James and I prepared for the battle ahead, I couldn't help but think about Max. He was lying in his usual spot by the window, his tail thumping softly as sunlight streamed in. Despite everything he'd been through, he seemed content, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Watching him reminded me why we were doing this, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who deserved to live in a community free from fear and bullying. Karen had underestimated us, and now it was time to show her that she couldn't push us around anymore. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. James and I woke up early, both too anxious to eat breakfast. We spent the morning going over our notes, rehearsing what we'd say, and reminding ourselves why this mattered. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about reclaiming our neighborhood from fear and intimidation. Still, as we walked into the community center where the meeting was being held, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The room buzzed with tension. Neighbors filled the rows of chairs, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Some looked supportive, nodding at us as we entered, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Karen sat at the front of the room, her clipboard resting on the table like a trophy. She wore an expression of smug confidence, as if she already knew she'd win no matter what happened. The HOA board members took their seats behind her, looking uncomfortable but trying to appear impartial. When the meeting began, the board president called for order and explained that the purpose was to address concerns about Karen's conduct. Before anyone else could speak, Karen stood up, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, glaring at us. "These people are liars. They've been violating HOA rules since they moved in. And now they're trying to ruin my reputation because I dared to stand up for what's right." Her words hung in the air, but instead of intimidating everyone, they seemed to have the opposite effect. One by one, neighbors started raising their hands to share their stories. Linda, the retired teacher who had helped us after the BBQ incident, was the first to speak. "I've lived here for 10 years, she began, her voice steady. "And I've seen how Karen treats people. She uses the rules as weapons to bully anyone who disagrees with her. What happened to Max and his family is just one example of many." Others followed, each recounting their own experiences. Mr. Patel talked about how Karen had yelled at him over his hedge trimmer. A young couple described how she'd reported them to the HOA for painting their front door a shade of blue she didn't approve of. Even someone who hadn't spoken to us directly before stood up to say, "I stayed quiet until now because I was afraid of retaliation, but enough is enough." This isn't leadership, it's harassment. Karen's face turned red as the testimonies piled up. She interrupted constantly, shouting objections and accusing people of lying. At one point, she even tried to storm out of the room, muttering something about how everyone was ganging up on her. But the board president stopped her, reminding her that she needed to stay and listen to the process. Finally, it was James's turn to speak. He stood up, his posture calm but resolute. "Max is more than just a dog. He's my service animal, trained to help me manage anxiety from my time in the military," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. What Karen did wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. She attacked an innocent animal, and then lied about it to manipulate the situation. That's not enforcing rules, that's abuse of power. By the time James finished speaking, the mood in the room had shifted completely. People nodded in agreement, some even clapping softly. For the first time, Karen looked uncertain, her confident facade cracking under the weight of the truth. When the board finally voted to suspend Karen pending a formal investigation, the relief was palpable. As we left the meeting, several neighbors approached us to thank us for standing up to her. One woman hugged me tightly and whispered, "You've given us our neighborhood back." But even as we celebrated this small victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. Still, for the first time in weeks, there was hope, and that made all the difference. The days following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind of emotions. While many neighbors celebrated the board's decision to suspend Karen, there was an underlying tension that lingered in the air. Some residents expressed their gratitude openly, stopping James and me in the driveway or at the mailbox to thank us for taking a stand. "You've given us hope," one older woman said, her eyes glistening with tears. "We've been living under her thumb for years." But not everyone was supportive. A handful of neighbors, those who had always aligned themselves with Karen, whispered behind our backs, casting suspicious glances our way. One even muttered something about how we'd stirred up trouble and ruined the peace of the neighborhood. It stung, but we reminded ourselves that change rarely comes without resistance. Karen, true to form, wasn't going down quietly. Within days, she began posting flyers around the community, accusing us of spreading lies and manipulating people into turning against her. The flyers were filled with exaggerated claims and dramatic language, like something out of a soap opera. She even went so far as to call a few residents directly, pleading her case and warning them that removing her from the board would lead to chaos. Her antics only fueled the growing divide in Willow Creek. Those who supported us saw through her tactics, recognizing them for what they were, desperate attempts to regain control. But others, particularly newer residents unfamiliar with her history, seemed unsure of whom to believe. It was clear that while the battle had been won, the war was far from over. Determined to keep the momentum going, James and I organized a follow-up meeting with our core group of supporters. We met in Linda's cozy living room, surrounded by homemade snacks and coffee brewed strong enough to keep us alert. The goal was simple: ensure that Karen's suspension became permanent and push for reforms within the HOA to prevent anyone else from abusing their power in the future. "We need to make this about more than just Karen," I said, leaning forward. "This is our chance to create real change, to build a neighborhood where everyone feels safe and respected." The group agreed, and ideas started flowing. Someone suggested creating a committee to review the HOA guidelines, ensuring they were fair and reasonable. Another proposed holding regular town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. By the end of the evening, we had a solid plan and a renewed sense of purpose. Meanwhile, Max became an unofficial mascot for our cause. Neighbors adored him, often stopping by to give him treats or scratch behind his ears. His presence served as a reminder of why we were fighting, not just for ourselves, but for the kind of community we wanted to live in. Even Mr. Patel, who had initially been hesitant to get involved, brought over a plate of homemade samosas one evening, saying, "For Max, and for standing up to that woman." As the weeks passed, life in Willow Creek slowly began to shift. People started talking to each other again, hosting impromptu gatherings, and working together on small projects like planting flowers in the common areas. There was still work to be done, of course, but the atmosphere felt lighter, freer. One afternoon, James and I sat on the porch, watching Max chase butterflies in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked, glancing at James. He smiled, though there was a hint of caution in his eyes. "Not completely, but we've taken the first step, and that's something." I nodded, letting the moment sink in. Whatever happened next, we'd face it together. And for now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Karen's presence in Willow Creek began to fade. She stopped attending HOA meetings altogether and eventually put her house on the market. Rumors spread that she'd found a new neighborhood, one with stricter rules and gated security, but no one seemed particularly interested in verifying the details. All anyone cared about was that she was gone, and for the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the people who lived there. The changes didn't happen overnight, of course. The board worked diligently to implement the reforms we proposed, starting with a thorough review of the HOA guidelines. Outdated or overly restrictive rules were either revised or removed entirely. For instance, the ban on outdoor decorations was replaced with a more flexible policy, allowing residents to express themselves as long as they kept things tasteful. Even the noise ordinance was adjusted to better reflect realistic expectations for a suburban neighborhood. Perhaps the most significant change was the creation of a resident advisory committee. Made up of volunteers from across Willow Creek, the group served as a bridge between homeowners and the HOA board, ensuring that decisions were made collaboratively rather than unilaterally. It gave everyone a voice, something that had been sorely missing under Karen's reign. Meetings became less formal and more open, with neighbors sharing ideas and working together to improve the community. James and I threw ourselves into these efforts, eager to help shape the future of our neighborhood. Max, ever the loyal companion, tagged along to every meeting, earning him even more fans among the residents. Kids loved running up to pet him, and he basked in the attention, his tail wagging nonstop. Watching him interact with the community reminded me of how much joy a single dog could bring, and how important it was to protect that kind of connection. As the months passed, Willow Creek transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. People started hosting block parties again, their laughter echoing through the streets late into the evening. Gardens flourished, now free from oppressive restrictions, and front porches came alive with colorful planters and wind chimes. Neighbors greeted each other warmly instead of ducking inside to avoid unwanted scrutiny. The sense of fear that had once hung over the community dissolved, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and camaraderie. Looking back, I realized that Karen's departure wasn't just the end of an era. It was the beginning of something better. Her actions, while cruel and selfish, had inadvertently united us. We'd stood up not just for ourselves, but for each other, proving that kindness and courage could overcome even the most toxic forces. One crisp autumn afternoon, James and I sat on the porch, sipping hot chocolate and watching Max play fetch with a couple of neighborhood kids. Leaves crunched underfoot as families strolled past, waving hello. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, a perfect snapshot of what a community should be. "You know," James said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think we finally got the neighborhood we always wanted." I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder. "Yeah, we did, and we couldn't have done it without Max, or you." Max trotted over then, dropping the ball at our feet with a hopeful bark. Laughing, James picked it up and tossed it across the yard. As the golden retriever bounded after it, I couldn't help but feel grateful for our home, for our friends, and for the resilience that had carried us through the storm. Karen may have tried to break us, but in doing so, she'd only made us stronger. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was ours. And that made all the difference.